The silence in the house was a physical presence, a third occupant in the rooms my father had so recently filled with his booming laughter and the perpetual, low-grade static of his discontent. It was the kind of quiet that amplified every small sound: the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the old oak floorboards settling in the night, the frantic thrumming of my own heart. He was away on a business trip, a rare 2-day excursion that had left my mother and me adrift in the vast, echoing space of our home, two separate islands in a sea of unspoken words and half-healed wounds. We had orbited each other all evening, a careful dance of microwaved leftovers and separate sinks for washing dishes, the television providing a meaningless, flickering buffer in the living room. Finally, the inane chatter of a late-night talk show became too much to bear. I retreated to the one place that had always felt like neutral ground, the heart of the house that now seemed to beat with a faint, irregular pulse, the kitchen. It was here, amidst the lingering scent of garlic and lemon-scented detergent, that my mother was already standing, her back to me, staring out the black window above the sink as if she could read some secret message in the reflections of the room. I moved to the counter, the cool formica a familiar comfort under my palms. The plan was simple, mundane, a ritual to fill the hollow quiet: hot chocolate. Not the instant powder kind, but the real deal. I pulled out the small saucepan, the one with the chipped blue enamel handle, and set it on the stove with a soft clink. The fridge door sighed open, and the light spilled onto the floor as I retrieved the carton of milk. The glug 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 as I poured it into the pan was absurdly loud. My mother turned from the window. Her face, usually a carefully composed mask of pleasant neutrality, was pale and seemed softer, the lines around her eyes and mouth more pronounced, as if the absence of my father's energy had allowed her own to relax, to sag into its true, weary shape. She watched me for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "Make enough for two, would you, Maya?" she asked, her voice softer than I'd heard it in months. It wasn't a command, but a request, fragile as a bird's egg. I nodded, adding more milk to the pan, the white liquid swirling. I fetched the good cocoa powder, the bar of dark chocolate, the sugar. The ritual began. The scrape of the spoon against the bottom of the pan as I stirred, the slow, magical melting of the solid chocolate into the warm milk, the rich, comforting aroma beginning to permeate the air, pushing back against the sterile silence. It was a scent from my childhood, a promise of safety and sweetness. My mother drifted over and leaned against the counter opposite me, her arms crossed. She was watching my hands, the deliberate, focused movements. "You still do it just the way I taught you," she murmured, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Some things stick," I said, my voice coming out tighter than I intended. We hadn't spoken of the fight, the one that had happened 3 weeks ago, a seismic eruption that had cracked the foundation of our family. It had been about my future, my refusal to follow the preordained path to the law degree my father had already mapped out for me. It had been about my art, which he called a frivolous hobby. And my mother had been there, in the room, a silent witness, her eyes darting between us like a frightened sparrow. She hadn't taken a side. Her silence had felt, to me, like a betrayal. The milk began to steam, tiny bubbles forming around the edges. I turned the heat down, my movements automatic. The tension in the room was shifting, the hot chocolate acting as a kind of social lubricant, warming more than just our soon-to-be hands. "He means well, you know," she said softly, breaking the silence that had begun to stretch again. Didn't he have to say who he was? I kept stirring, my knuckles white around the spoon. Does he, or does he just mean to have his own way? It's the same thing, in his mind. She sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to come from the very solace of her feet. He sees the world as a series of battles to be won. He thinks he's armoring you for them. I don't want his armor. It's too heavy. It crushes you instead of protecting you." The words were out before I could stop them, sharp and accusatory. I glanced at her, expecting the usual placating response, the "you'll understand when you're older" deflection. But it didn't come. Instead, she looked at me, really looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a startling, profound empathy. "I know," she said, simply. 2 words, but they landed with the force of a revelation. They were an acknowledgement, a validation I had been starving for. I stopped stirring. The chocolate was perfectly smooth, dark, and inviting. I poured it into 2 large, ceramic mugs, the ones with the chipped rims we'd had forever. I handed one to her. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and her skin was cold. We stood there, in the pool of light from the overhead lamp, cradling our mugs. The first sip was a burst of memory and warmth, a liquid hug. She closed her eyes as she drank, and when she opened them, they were glistening. "This kitchen," she began, her voice distant, almost dreamlike. "It holds so many ghosts. Good ones, mostly." She gestured with her chin towards the kitchen table, its scarred wooden surface littered with the day's mail. "Your father proposed to me right there. Did you know that?" I shook my head, taking another sip, letting the information settle. I'd always imagined some fancy restaurant. It was a Tuesday. He'd made me spaghetti, and he'd burned the garlic bread so badly the smoke alarm went off. We were laughing, trying to fan the smoke away with a tea towel, and he just got down on one knee, right there in the mess. Didn't have a ring? He used the twist tie from the bread bag. A genuine, unguarded laugh escaped her, a sound I realized I hadn't heard in years. It transformed her face, smoothing the lines, lighting up her eyes. For a moment, she was the girl in the story, not my tired, careworn mother. He was different then, she continued, the smile fading. So full of possibility. He wasn't so afraid. Afraid of what? Of failing. Of not being enough. His own father, well, that's a story for another time. She took a long, slow drink of her hot chocolate, as if fortifying herself. The world hardened him. Or maybe he hardened himself to face the world. I'm not sure anymore. We lapsed into silence again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a listening silence, a waiting one. The story of the bread twist tie proposal had opened a door, and I could feel the weight of other, untold stories pressing against it from the other side. She set her empty mug down on the counter with a definitive click. She walked over to the oldest cabinet, the one tucked into the corner, its paint peeling slightly. It was where she kept the vases, the odd platters we never used, and, I presumed, a lifetime supply of unused candles. But she reached deep into the back, her body half disappearing into the dark space, and emerged not with a candle, but with a small, rectangular box. It was made of a rich, dark wood, inlaid with a lighter, intricate pattern that I recognized as rosewood. It was dusty, and it looked ancient. She brought it over to the kitchen table and set it down between us. It was about the size of a large book, and it had a small, brass clasp that was tarnished with age. "I've never shown this to anyone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her fingers, usually so capable and brisk, trembled slightly as they hovered over the clasp. "Not even your father." The air in the kitchen seemed to still, to thicken. The hum of the fridge faded into nothing. This was no longer just a night alone with my mother. This was a crossing of a threshold. The kitchen, with its familiar checkerboard floor and the lingering scent of chocolate, had become a sacred space, a confessional. "My life," she began, her eyes fixed on the box, "didn't he start when I met your father, Maya? I know it must seem that way sometimes. But before I was his wife, before I was your mother, I was someone else." With a soft click, she undid the brass clasp. She didn't open the lid immediately. Instead, she looked at me, and in her gaze, I saw a terrifying vulnerability, a raw, naked hope that I would understand what she was about to share. "This," she said, her hand resting on the lid of the wooden box, "is who I was." And as she lifted the lid, the night alone with my mother in the kitchen vanished, and in its place, a whole other world began to unfold.